The rain hammered the slate roof of the silver ridge, each drop a cold drum that echoed against the glass walls of the rooftop bar. Neon lights flickered on the alleyway below, painting the street in bruised violets and sickly greens, while the scent of wet asphalt rose like a promise of tomorrow's traffic. I stood at the edge of the table, my hand resting on a crystal tumbler that caught the low light and threw amber shards across the polished wood. My thumb brushed the rim, feeling the slight chill of the glass, a reminder that even steel-cored wolves can be tempered by something as simple as a drink. The poker chips clattered as I tossed a silver one onto the pile, a wager that felt more like a ritual than a gamble. My eyes, amber and steady, scanned the faces at the table. The rival pack leader, Grayson, lounged with his usual smug grin, his jawline sharp enough to cut the night air. Beside him, a line of our pack's beta, their shoulders hunched, eyes flickering with restless energy. I could hear the low growl of the pack from the hallway, a soft, almost animalistic sigh that rose and fell with the wind. My mind, trained for numbers and contracts, filed the odds in a silent ledger. One more hand, one more chance to reinforce a legacy that had never faltered. A server slipped past the edge of the bar, a tray balanced on her hip, the faint jingle of silverware the only sound louder than the rain. She moved with the practiced grace of someone who had learned to disappear into the background, her hair pulled into a messy bun, a smear of flour on the side of her cheek that I could swear was from a bakery she'd visited earlier. I caught the scent of cinnamon and dough on her breath, sweet enough to momentarily soften the metallic taste of whiskey at the back of my throat. She paused near the edge of the table, her eyes flicking to the cards laid out before me. I could see the way her fingers, slightly thick and calloused, trembled as she adjusted the tray, a subtle ripple of motion, like a fish testing the water. She was too close for comfort, yet I didn't pull away. The disturbance of her presence was a reminder that, even in my controlled world, chaos found a way to slip through the cracks. I lifted my glass, the amber liquid catching the glow of the streetlights, and tipped it toward Grayson. "To a night worth remembering," I said, my voice low, the smoothness of it slipping over the words like a well-worn coat. The glass clinked, a sharp note that cut through the rain's percussion. Grayson laughed, a sound that seemed to vibrate the very air. And to the alpha who thinks he can keep his pack in line without a little entertainment. His eyes narrowed as he glanced at the server Lucia, I later learned who was busy arranging napkins with a nervous smile that didn't quite reach the corners of her mouth. The dealer dealt the cards, the soft thud of each one a reminder of the stakes. My mind ran through the ledger of my life, property acquisitions, board meetings, the ever-present whisper of the blood moon that threatened to strip away the veneer I wore like armor. Control was everything. The pack depended on my ability to keep the beast at bay, to make decisions that would not betray the name Reynolds. The thought of a single misstep sent a cold ripple through my spine, a reminder of the night my mother left, chasing a flicker of humanity that had nothing to do with the pack. That memory, half burned and half forgotten, still left a taste of ash in my mouth. The cards fell, the dealer's hand steady. I saw the queen of spades slide across the table, its black feathered design catching the light. I could feel the pressure building in my chest, a familiar tightening that I always linked to the shift. In the same instant, I sensed her shift in the air, the faint scent of yeast and cinnamon mingling with the rain. She held her breath, eyes fixed on the deck, as though the fate of her own future hinged on the outcome. The final card was turned, and the room seemed to hold its breath. My hand, the one I'd spent years perfecting, was a mirror of confidence. I pushed my chips forward, a slick motion that sent the silver pieces glinting across the table like tiny moons. "All in," I said, my voice a low rumble, the words barely louder than the rain. Grayson smirked, then placed his own bet, his fingers brushing the edge of the table, sending a faint vibration that I could feel through my own bones. The server Lucia caught the motion out of the corner of her eye, her dark lashes fluttering as she tried to keep her composure. She pressed a wristwatch against her chest, the metallic clang of the clasp a small, stubborn sound that cut through the tension. The cards were laid, the dealer's hand steady as ever. My queen of spades met the king of hearts in a silence that seemed louder than any shout. The room exhaled. I felt a surge of triumph, the familiar rush of power that came with a win, and a shadow of something else, a pang of recognition at the way Lucia's shoulders hunched for a moment, as if she'd swallowed a breath she couldn't spit out. Grayson's smile faltered, his eyes flickering to the server. "You've got quite the gamble there, Reynolds," he said, his tone laced with something that sounded like a challenge and a warning. I could see the flicker of his own beast, a low growl resonating from his throat, barely audible over the rain. I leaned back, the leather of my chair creaking under my weight, and let the moment settle. The deck was a blur now, but the image of her flour-dusted cheek, the way she balanced the tray with nervous precision, stuck in my mind like a stubborn stain. I could sense her internal rhythm, the quickening of her pulse each time a card hit the table, the way she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, the faint tremor that ran through her fingers when she reached for the next napkin. "Your bet's good," I said, keeping my voice even, "but the house always takes its cut." The words were a half joke, a reminder that I could not afford to let my guard down, not even for a fleeting chance at softness. She gave a small, tight laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. "And the house always wins in the end," she replied, the lilac timbre of her voice warm enough to cut through the static of the night. She glanced at the window, where the rain fell in sheets, each drop a tiny mirror reflecting the streetlights. For a second, the world seemed to narrow to that pane of glass, the sound of the rain a metronome to the thoughts racing in her head. I caught a hint of her fear then, an undercurrent of something that pressed against her ribs, like the weight of a debt she could not name. It resonated with a part of me I kept locked behind steel doors, the fear of being seen, of having every flaw exposed for the world to laugh at. My own fear was a different beast, one that snarled at the thought of letting anyone in, especially someone whose world was measured in invoices and ovens instead of territories and packs. The dealer slid the final chip toward Grayson, a small silver disc that glinted like a fresh moon in the rain. Grayson's hand hovered, his knuckles white. The room seemed to hold its breath again, waiting for the inevitable turn. I could hear the distant howl of wolves, a sound that always reminded me of the blood moon that loomed in the sky, a curse that could strip me of control in an instant. Grayson placed his chip beside mine, his smile widening just enough to show a flash of teeth. "We'll see who walks out of this night with their pride intact," he said, his voice low, the words rolling like gravel over a road. He glanced at the server again, his eyes narrowing. He saw something in her, maybe a flicker of defiance, maybe the desperation of a woman who'd been told she didn't belong. I felt the prick of his stare through the room, as if he were trying to read the script on my skin. I caught my own reflection in the darkened window, a man whose eyes still held that amber fire, but whose mouth was set in a line that could not be broken. The rain intensified, each drop striking the roof with a hollow thud that seemed to echo the beating of my heart. Mason, my lieutenant, leaned in close, his breath warm against my ear, his voice a sandpaper whisper. "Remember, Kai, the pack watches everything. One false move and the council will have more than just a rumor to chew on." His words were a reminder that my actions were never truly my own. They were a web woven from expectation, duty, and the ever-watchful eyes of those who had raised me. I nodded, feeling the weight of his confidence settle on my shoulders like a mantle. "Understood," I replied, my voice even. The syllable understood, a single breath that barely disturbed the air. From the edge of the crowd, a security guard shuffled his steps, his badge glinting in the neon. He glanced at me, then at Lucia, then back, his expression a mixture of boredom and suspicion. He caught my eye briefly, his stare lingering on the scar that ran down his forearm, something I'd never asked about. A question formed in his mind, perhaps about why a man of my stature was gambling in a place where the decks were rigged, but he said nothing. His silence was another loop, a small ripple that could later surface who was watching, and why. As the final cards were revealed, the rain began to thin, the heavy curtain of water slipping into a mist that clung to the rooftop's edge. The wind carried the faint smell of pine from the nearby woods, a reminder that the forest was never far, that the pack's territory lay just beyond the city's concrete veil. My thoughts fluttered between the win and the cost, the thrill of the gamble and the invisible price I hadn't yet considered. Lucia stood on the opposite side of the table, her shoulders rigid, her hands clasped around a cup of tea that steamed in the cool night air. I saw a droplet of tea slide down the side of the cup, landing on the polished wood and leaving a tiny, dark circle. She lifted her gaze, meeting mine for a split second. In her eyes, I caught the flicker of something I couldn't name, a resolve that hinted at hidden strength, and a vulnerability that made the amber in my own eyes stir. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to that exchange, the rain a distant murmur, the pack's howls a low refrain in the distance. I felt the tug of an unseen rope, pulling at the edge of my chest, a mixture of curiosity and caution. The code of the pack, the expectations of the board, and the echo of my mother's abandonment all pressed against me, but there was also an unfamiliar heat, a spark that threatened to ignite something beyond strategy. The dealer cleared the table, sliding the cards into a tray, the soft clatter like a closing book. The silver chip I'd wagered sat beside Grayson's, both glinting in the dim light. The night had given me a victory, but the cost was already beginning to take shape in the hollow space where Lucia's eyes lingered. She turned, shoulders hunched as she moved toward the back of the bar, passing a narrow staircase that led down to the kitchen. I watched her footsteps, soft, deliberate, the sound of her heel against the wet wood a muted rhythm. Behind me, Mason's hand rested on the back of my chair, his fingers brushing my spine. "You just made a powerful enemy tonight," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. "And you might have just made a complication." I could hear the wind sway the metal shutters, a soft creak that seemed to echo his words. My mind catalogued the new variables: a woman with flour on her cheek, a rival pack leader who thrived on humiliation, and a code that bound me tighter than any boardroom contract. Each element whispered a different story, a loop that would intertwine later. What would happen when a human became entangled in the affairs of a wolf pack? How would the board react to a marriage that was anything but conventional? And what secret did the scar on the guard's arm hide? The rain finally ceased, leaving a clean, wet sheen on the rooftop, reflecting the city's neon like a mirror of possibilities. I stood, the weight of my coat pressing against my shoulders, and felt the tremor of the beast within, subdued but ever present. I adjusted my tie, the silk sliding over the skin of my neck, and caught one last glance at Lucia as she disappeared down the staircase, the scent of cinnamon faintly lingering in the air, a reminder that some things could not be neatly filed away. The night stretched ahead, thick with promise and peril. My mind, ever the ledger, began to tally the costs of this gamble, not just the chips on the table, but the unseen debts that would soon demand payment. The storm had passed, but the clouds of doubt gathered, ready to cast shadows over the path I thought I controlled. The game was far from over. Kai. The night air in the master suite clung to my skin like the mist from the ridge forest, thin and cold where the window cracked open to the howl of distant wolves. I stood by the fireplace, the amber flames licking the stone mantel, the scent of pine sap and old leather grounding me. The door hissed shut behind Lucia, and the soft click of the lock sounded louder than any council gavel. I ran a thumb over the leather strap of my cuff, its grain worn smooth from years of tightening and loosening during deals and pack rituals. Her presence lingered in the space between the chairs, a faint trace of cinnamon and dough that the fire failed to consume. She moved toward the kitchen, each step a muted thud on the hardwood, the carpeted rug at the doorway swallowing the sound. I watched the way her fingers brushed the edge of the counter, leaving a faint oil film that caught the light, a reminder that she'd been kneading flour minutes before. My own hand twitched, the beast inside reacting to the proximity I'd tried to keep at arm's length. I heard the faint clink of a spoon against a pot, the low murmur of water boiling, and a soft exhale that seemed to steady the tremor in my shoulders. "Tea?" I asked, voice low, the word hanging between us like a fragile branch. It wasn't an invitation, it was a concession, a need to fill the silence that threatened to crack the fragile veneer of the night. She turned, eyes meeting mine over the rim of a ceramic mug, the lilac hue of her voice catching in the steam. "If you want," she replied, the syllables arriving with a tremor that matched the steam curling from the cup. The heat brushed my cheek, momentarily softening the iron that cloaked my jaw. I took the mug, feeling the ceramic's warmth seep into my palm, and placed it on the table where the fire's glow painted amber patterns across the wood. "Aren't you cold?" she asked, eyes flicking to the window where the moon's thin slice barely lit the courtyard below. The question was simple, but the breath of wind that slipped through the cracked pane brushed my neck, a reminder of the night's chill and the colder whispers of the council waiting for my misstep. I rapped a finger against the edge of the table, the sound sharp as if measuring the distance between us. "The fire's enough," I said, though my chest tightened as the scent of fresh bread from her earlier shift mingled with the pine, coaxing a memory of my mother's kitchen, her laughter, the way she'd knead dough with love, before she vanished into human arms. The memory tasted bitter, like ash on my tongue. She set the mug down, the clatter echoing through the room, and reached for a small wooden bowl on the shelf, pulling out a handful of cracked hazelnuts. The rind scraped against the wood, a sound that reminded me of the pack's old training grounds, the crack of branches under paw. She tossed a nut into her mouth, the crack audible, and chewed slowly, the rhythm matching the beat of my own heart that I could feel thudding within my ribs. For a moment, the beast's growl softened, as if listening to the cadence of her breath. "Do you ever wonder if there's a way out?" she asked, voice barely above the fire's hiss. Her eyes lingered on the flames, the orange light catching the faint scar on my forearm, a scar I'd never spoken of, one the guard on the rooftop had noticed and not asked about. The question floated, tangled with the council's impending warning and the board's thinly veiled threats, yet it landed squarely on the part of me that feared opening any doorway at all. I swallowed, the fire's heat striking the back of my throat. "There are always doors," I replied, the words tasting like steel. The phrase echoed a line Mason had once whispered about loyalty and power, a reminder that my choices were not solely mine. I glanced at the hazelnut she cradled, the way a fleck of oil glistened on her nail, and felt the animal impulse to protect coil tighter, not wanting to let her see the flicker of uncertainty beneath the alpha's mask. "Lucia." The kitchen smelled of rosemary and butter, the tang of melted cheese clinging to the air as a pot simmered on the stove. I set the kettle down with a soft thud, the glass humming against the wood, and turned to face the doorway where Kai stood, his silhouette framed by the firelight. The heat brushed my cheek, and a thin fog of steam rose from the pot, curling around the copper pot rack like a sleepy cat. My hands had the faint imprint of flour still on my skin, the powdery residue catching the light as I lifted the mug to my lips. The tea was warm, the slight bitterness of the leaves mingling with the sweet undertone of honey I'd added just enough to mask the metallic taste of worry that lingered behind my thoughts about Mateo's tuition and the looming deadline for the board's quarterly report. I could hear the distant bark of a golden retriever from the neighbor's yard, a sound that reminded me of my childhood routine of walking the dog after school, before the weight of bills had settled like a stone in my chest. Kai's voice cut through the steam, low and measured, as if he were calculating something beyond the words. "The fire's enough." The phrase hung, and I caught the faint scent of his cologne cypress and a hint of iron that seemed to cling to his skin like a second fur. I wanted to ask him about the scar on his forearm, the one that caught Mason's eye, but the question sat like a stone in my throat, heavy with a fear that probing too deep would fracture whatever fragile truce we'd formed. I set the mug down on the wooden table, the ceramic clink resonating in the quiet. The hazelnuts cracked under my teeth, each bite releasing a buttery note that matched the soft pop of the fire. I watched the amber flames lick the stone, the way their light made the shadows in his eyes shift, the amber glint that sometimes slipped through his gaze when his beast stirred. My own heart thudded against the ribs, matching the rhythm of the kettle's whistle, a reminder that I was still tied to the world of numbers and deadlines, even as I stood in this den of wolves. I pushed a plate of fresh bread toward him, the crust golden, steam rising like a veil. "You look like you could use something solid," I said, the lilac timbre of my voice catching on the edge of humor, a thin shield against the vulnerability that threatened to surface whenever I lingered near this man who carried a pack on his shoulders. He took a piece, the crust cracking under his teeth, and for a second his jaw relaxed, the tight line softening like a wolf easing into a den. He glanced at the scar again, a flicker of something, perhaps memory, perhaps a warning crossing his features before he set the bread down and met my eyes. "You're right," he said, voice barely above the fire's crackle. "Solid is necessary." The words struck me, a reminder of the council's next meeting, the whispers that Grayson fed to the elders about my unfit status, and the board's thinly veiled threat of a hostile takeover. I pressed a damp cloth against the back of my neck, feeling the chill of the basement's stone floor seep through my blouse. My mind raced. Mateo's acceptance letter sat in my inbox, his smile waiting, while the debt I'd paid for Kai's gamble now tethered us together like a rope I couldn't cut. A sudden slam echoed from the hallway as the guard outside the front door slammed it shut, the metal clang reverberating through the house. The sound snagged my attention like a loose thread pulling at a tapestry, hinting at a storm brewing beyond the walls. I glanced at Kai, his amber eyes reflecting the fire, and for the first time noticed the faint tremor in his hand as he reached for another piece of bread. We ate in silence, the only sounds the pop of the fire, the hiss of the kettle, and the occasional crack of a nut under my teeth. The heat wrapped around us, a thin barrier that both separated and bound us, forcing a conversation we hadn't planned but couldn't avoid. As the night deepened, the wind outside began to moan through the eaves, and I felt the weight of a promise I hadn't yet made to stay, to fight, to maybe let someone see the cracks beneath the armor. The fire sputtered, casting wavering shadows that danced across his jawline, and I wondered if the pack would ever accept a human as part of its story, or if another hidden player, perhaps the scarred guard or Mason's silent doubts, would pull us apart before we could even learn the shape of each other's wounds. The fire crackled, spitting amber sparks onto the stone hearth as I slipped the leather-bound ledger onto the table. My fingers brushed the worn edge, feeling the slight give of the paper where the margin had been torn years ago, my father's signature haunting the bottom line. A draft slipped through the cracked window, carrying the faint scent of pine sap and the distant howl of a lone wolf, and I inhaled it as if it were a promise. Lucia stood nearby, her apron smeared with flour, the dust catching the light like tiny constellations. She reached for a copper pot, the metal warm from the stove, and her wrist brushed my own as she handed it to me. The contact lingered, a subtle tremor that surged through the muscles in my forearm, reminding me that my beast was listening. I cleared my throat, the sound echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "We need to settle the accounts before the council meets," I said, pretending the numbers were the only thing on my mind. My eyes flicked to the ledger, then to the scar that traced a pale line down my forearm, the one Mason never asked about. I felt the familiar urge to tighten my jaw, to silence the curiosity that rose when she stared too long at the wound. "I'm ready," she replied, her voice a lilac haze that softened the metal clang of the pot. She set the pot down with a careful click, and a stray crumb of rosemary fell onto the floorboards, its sharp perfume rising. I knelt without thinking, the cold wood seeping through my trousers, and snapped it up with my thumb. The herb's bite reminded me of the bitterness I kept hidden behind boardroom smiles. "My mother, she paid a price for love," I whispered, the words slipping out before I could censor them. The confession hung between us, as fragile as the steam curling from the kettle. I watched her eyes widen just enough to catch the amber flicker of my own turmoil. The firelight danced on her cheeks, revealing a faint line of worry that mirrored the crease on my own brow. She placed a hand, warm and flour-stained, over the scar, the grain of the wood beneath our fingertips humming with old family ghosts. "You're not alone in this," she murmured, and the house seemed to inhale around us. A knock echoing through hallway reminded me of board's deadline, and I wondered if Mateo's scholarship letter would survive this still night. I slipped the heavy oak door shut behind me, the low thud resonating through the stone hallway like a warning. The fireplace in the sitting room threw amber tongues across the polished walnut floor, and the scent of pine sap mixed with the faint metallic tang of the damp night air that sneaked in through the cracked casement. I could hear the soft exhale of the house settling, the creak of a floorboard a step away from where Lucia stood at the kitchen counter, her shoulders hunched as she measured the flour with a glass bowl. The way her fingers, still dusted with specks of white, gripped the rim told me she was already bracing for the weight of the dough, as if every grain were a promise she was trying to keep from crumbling. "Can't have you burning the place down before breakfast," I said, stepping into the doorway, the leather of my coat scraping the hem of my trousers. My voice, low and measured, seemed to echo off the high ceilings, pulling the attention of the house's oldest portrait, a stern man in a velvet waistcoat, down to us. She turned, a flicker of surprise crossing the pink of her cheeks before she caught herself and let a small laugh slip out, the sound catching on the steam rising from the pot of water on the stove. "You always know when I'm about to start a fire," Lucia replied, sliding a wooden spoon into the pot, the clatter crisp against the copper. The spoon's handle left a faint imprint on the polished wood of the table's edge, a reminder that she had been here before, that she was already part of this rhythm. I watched the way she lifted the ladle, the muscles of her forearm flexing under the thin skin, the tiny scar at the base of her thumb, something I hadn't noticed before. She ran a fingertip over it absently. My own hand brushed the scar that ran down my forearm, the reminder of the night the moon had bled red and the beast within me had snarled louder than the wolves in the woods. I placed my palm on the back of the counter, feeling the coolness of the marble seep through my glove, the solidness grounding the lingering tremor in my jaw. "The ledger should be on the desk when I'm done," I said, moving toward the study, the heavy door groaning as it swung open. I could feel the weight of the leather-bound book on the mahogany desk before I saw it, the faint smell of old paper and tobacco curling up from its spine. I pulled it out, the leather creaking, and the pages rustled like dry leaves. The numbers stared back at me, cold and unyielding, but my eyes drifted to a half-open drawer on the side. The brass knob was crooked, as if someone had been searching for something and left it in haste. "Did you notice anything odd in the accounts this morning?" I asked without looking up, the words slipping into the quiet. She set down the tray of fresh rolls, their crust golden and steam rising in delicate curls, and walked over, the soft click of her shoes on the rug marking each step. She placed a hand on the edge of the desk, the warmth of her palm against the cool wood, a subtle pressure that made the room feel smaller. "There's a discrepancy in the last quarter's expenses," she said, pointing to a line of numbers with a flour-stained fingertip. "A payment to a vendor that doesn't exist in our files. It's like the name was erased after it was entered." I frowned, the line of my brow tightening as my mind catalogued the implication. The council would love a loophole to question my stewardship, and Grayson's whispers already curled through the corridors like smoke. "Who signed off on that?" I asked, the question a thin veil over the suspicion that crawled upward, tickling the edge of my mistrust. She looked up, eyes meeting mine, the amber of my own reflected in her lilac irises. "The signature is smudged," she whispered, the lilac timbre catching on the word smudged as if it were a secret that needed soft handling. "It could be yours, could be Mason's. The ink is fresh, like it was added yesterday." The realization that someone had altered the ledger in the dead of night set a cold prickle along my spine. I glanced at the drawer again, the knob now turning slightly in the faint breeze that slipped through the cracked window. "Someone's been here after hours," I said, voice barely louder than the fire's crackle, the words tasting like ash. Lucia's shoulders relaxed a fraction, the tension in her neck easing as if the weight of that secret was shared. She lifted a roll to her mouth, the soft dough yielding under her teeth, the buttery interior leaving a faint glaze on her lips. Maybe it's just a mistake, she suggested, but the way she forced a smile, the way the corners of her mouth trembled, told me she was holding something back, perhaps the fear that any mistake could unravel the fragile peace we'd been forced to keep. We ate in silence, the only sounds the occasional pop of the fire and the soft clink of a fork against a plate. My eyes drifted to the window, where the moon hung low, a thin scythe cutting through the night, and I could hear the far-off howl of a lone wolf, a reminder that the pack was restless, that the council's patience was thin. The taste of the roll lingered, a warm, yeasty comfort that contrasted with the cold edge of the numbers on the ledger. After breakfast, I escorted her to the greenhouse, the glass walls fogged from the early morning chill. The air inside was thick with the smell of damp earth and blossoming jasmines, the petals of an orchid drooping slightly under the weight of dew. She knelt beside a pot, her hands digging into the soil, the coolness seeping through her shirt sleeves, the scent of mud rising to meet the jasmine. "You like plants?" I asked, watching the muscles in her forearms as she lifted a small seedling, the green of the leaves vivid against the dark soil. She glanced up, a speck of dirt on her cheek catching the light. "They're the only things that grow without having to ask for permission," she said, a half laugh slipping out, the sound softening the tension that clung to the morning air. Her gaze lingered on a row of lavender bushes, their fragrance sweet and calming, and I found myself inhaling the scent, feeling it settle in my chest like a promise. I leaned against the stone archway, the coolness of the marble seeping through my coat, listening to the faint rustle of leaves outside. A distant car alarm jolted the morning quiet, the sound sharp and out of place among the serenity. I felt the urge to snap the moment, to assert control, but instead I let the feeling pass, the beast within me snarling at the intrusion before it softened into a low growl of curiosity. "Your brother's school is in the city, right?" I asked, the question a thread pulling us toward something larger than the garden. She paused, hand still cradling the seedling, the soil staining the fibers of her glove. "Mateo's accepted a scholarship at Westmont," she said, the lilac timbre wavering just enough to betray the pride and the dread she felt. "It's a chance for him, but the tuition isn't covered. I'm still waiting on the final numbers from the board." I stepped closer, the distance between us narrowing as the garden's stone path rose under my boots. "I can look into the accounts, see if there's any leeway," I offered, the words sliding out with the ease of someone used to making deals, but the intent behind them felt different, more personal, less transactional. She looked at me, the amber of the sunrise catching the flecks of orange in my eyes, and I could see the walls she had built around her heart flicker. "I don't need a favor," she said, the sarcasm a thin veil. "I've always managed on my own." The wind picked up, rustling the leaves, and a shard of paper fluttered from the edge of the ledger on the desk we'd left behind, landing on the grass like a secret waiting to be read. I crouched, fingers brushing the damp earth, and picked it up. The ink was smudged, the name half erased, but a watermark, an emblem of the Reynolds family crest, peeped through the blot. My pulse quickened, a reminder that the house held more secrets than the rooms we walked through. "You're not alone in this," I murmured, handing her the paper, the texture of the page rough against her palm. She held it for a heartbeat, the weight of it a physical reminder of the unseen forces at play, then slipped it into the lining of her apron, the fabric swallowing the clue like a promise kept. Later, as dusk settled and the sky bruised into deep violet, we found ourselves in the den, the fire now a low ember casting wavering shadows across the first soft tapestries. A pack of wolves lay sprawled across the stone floor, their breathing a rhythmic rise and fall, the scent of pine and musk filling the room. I took a seat on the low bench, the wood cool against my thigh, and watched the wolves' eyes flicker in the firelight. Lucia stood near the hearth, the heat washing over her hair, making the dark curls glint like spun silk. "Do you ever wonder what it would be like if the pack weren't bound by rules?" she asked, voice barely louder than the crackle of the flames, the question threading through the tension like a needle. I stared into the fire, the orange tongues licking the stones, the way the light played on my own scar, the faint line that traced the path of an old wound. Rules keep us from tearing each other apart, I said, tapping the scar with a fingertip, the pain a dull throb reminding me of the cost of freedom. She turned, her hand brushing the edge of the stone mantle, the coolness of the stone seeping into her skin. Or they keep us from living, she whispered, the phrase hanging in the air, the warmth of the fire mixing with the chill of the stone. The wolves shifted, a low growl reverberating through the room, and I felt the beast inside stir, the amber in my eyes flashing for an instant. I clenched my jaw, the muscles in my face tightening as I fought the urge to roar back at the imagined constraints. Instead, I let my hand rest on the back of her chair, the wood warm from the fire, the contact a silent acknowledgement that perhaps the rules could bend for those who dared to step beyond them. A soft rustle came from the doorway. A figure in a dark coat slipped in, a silhouette framed by the hallway's dim light. I glanced up, catching the glint of a silver badge clipped to the coat. The figure paused, the silhouette resolving into Deputy Hale, the council's liaison. "Hi," he said, his voice edged with something like urgency. "The council wants an update on the marriage status. They're not happy with the rumors circulating about." His words trailed off as his eyes flicked to Lucia, who stood poised near the fire, her chin lifted, the faint crescent of a scar on her wrist catching the firelight. I felt a surge of protectiveness, the beast's growl resonating low in my throat, but also a flicker of uncertainty. Could I let the council see her as a threat, or would that expose us both? Hale turned to leave, the coat swishing, but not before he slipped a folded note into the crack of the mantelpiece, the paper crisp and unmarked. I felt the weight of it even before I saw it, a promise of an unsaid agenda. The fire crackled, the wolves shifted again, and the room seemed to hold its breath. I turned back to Lucia, the note still hidden. "We'll talk later," I said, voice steady, the words a barrier between us and the council's prying eyes. She nodded, the flicker of the fire reflecting in her eyes, the silhouette of her face softening as she lifted a hand, the fingertips brushing the edge of the mantle a fraction closer to my own. The contact sent a shiver through the wood, through my forearm, through the scar. The beast within me snarled softly, then settled, as if listening to a rhythm only she could hear. Later, when the house settled into night and the wolves howled a distant chorus that seemed to echo through the rafters, we found ourselves in the kitchen again. The sink was full of dishes, the clatter of plates a metronome to the silence between us. I washed a pot, the suds slipping through my fingers, the water warm against my skin, while Lucia stood opposite, her back to the window, the moonlight painting a silver line along the curve of her spine. She reached for a mug, the ceramic cool under her palm, and poured herself a tea, the steam curling upward, curling around the edge of the counter like a living thing. She took a sip, the bitterness of the tea coating her tongue, the warmth spreading through her chest. "You're an odd man, Kai," she said, the lilac timbre softening, the words threading through the steam. "You keep a house like a vault, but you let the fire burn in the basement." I leaned against the counter, the wood rough against my cheek, and let the fire's memory flicker behind my eyes. "A vault keeps things safe," I replied, the words a low rumble, "but a fire can warm a soul." She turned, eyes meeting mine, the amber of my stare reflected back, and for a moment the world narrowed to the space between us, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant howl, the scent of tea and pine mingling. Her hand lifted, fingers trembling slightly, and she placed it on the back of my neck, the pressure gentle, the warmth of her skin a contrast to the chill that lingered from the night's earlier chill. I felt the animal inside me shift, a low purr reverberating through my chest as if the beast recognized a voice that could calm the storm. My fingers found the edge of her wrist, tracing the faint scar there, the scar that mirrored mine, a silent acknowledgement of wounds we both carried. The scar was just a line, thin and pale, but it belonged to a story I had never heard, one of a childhood accident perhaps, or a hidden surgery. The question lingered, a shimmer in the air. "You're always looking for a reason," Lucia whispered, her breath warm against my ear. the scent of cinnamon from the day's baking still clinging to her hair. What's the reason for the scar? I swallowed, the words catching in my throat. The night tastes metallic. A mistake, I said finally, the syllable rough like gravel, one I'm still trying to fix. The confession dropped like a stone into a still pond, the ripples spreading outward. She didn't ask for more. Instead, she smiled, a small, private curve of her lips, the smile reaching her eyes, the amber of my own eyes softening. We all have things we can't fix, she said, the lilac timbre tinged with a hint of something deeper, perhaps resignation, perhaps hope. The clock on the mantel chimed midnight, its wooden gong resonating through the room, the sound a reminder that time marched on regardless of the secrets we kept. A draft slipped through the cracked window, carrying with it the faint aroma of rain on stone, and the house seemed to sigh, as if relieved to have a moment of peace amid the storm of obligations. We moved to the living room, the fire now a smoldering bed of ash, the wolves curled in a tight knot, their breathing rhythmic. I pulled a blanket from the back of a sofa, the wool coarse against my fingertips, and draped it over both of us. The weight of the fabric settled, the shared heat a quiet promise that we would face whatever lay beyond the walls together. As we sat, the note that Deputy Hale had slipped into the mantelpiece burned a hole in my pocket. I could feel it against my thigh, the paper thin and unforgiving, the words inside a catalyst for a future conflict. I held it there, unspoken, the secret looping through my mind like a forbidden thread. Lucia's hand found mine, the skin soft, the oils of her palms smelling faintly of basil and butter, the contact grounding me, pulling me back from the edge of the unknown. I squeezed her hand, the gesture more instinct than decision, the simple pressure speaking louder than any vow I could utter. The night stretched on, the house breathing around us, the wolves' soft growls a lullaby, the scent of mint from a stray herb pot drifting up from the kitchen. Somewhere in the house, a door clicked shut, a sound that hinted at another presence, perhaps the council's spymaster, perhaps someone else with an interest in our marriage, perhaps a betrayal waiting to surface. We stayed there, the blanket a small island in a sea of uncertainty, the fire's last ember fading, the darkness outside pressing against the windows. In that hush, I felt the beast inside settle, the amber in my eyes dimming to a soft gold, the hunger for control loosening just enough to let another's heartbeat synchronize with mine. And Lucia, feeling the same cooling of fire, let a single tear escape, the salty drop catching the moonlight before it fell onto the wool, a quiet testament to the walls we were slowly tearing down. The morning after the hunt, the kitchen smelled of burnt pine and fresh coffee, steam curling around the copper kettle like a ghost. I watched Lucia slice an apple. The knife's steel caught the light, and her thumb brushed the flesh, leaving a thin line of red that vanished with her smile. "Figures," I said, pushing a warm mug toward her. "The council will send another summons by noon." She laughed, short and nervous, and set the apple aside. "Maybe they'll finally notice I'm more than a ledger." Her voice trembled, and the cinnamon from yesterday's rolls seemed to cling to the air between us. A sharp knock echoed from the hallway. Deputy Hale slipped in, badge glinting, and handed me the sealed envelope. "The council requests an immediate audit of Reynolds Holdings. They suspect the marriage is a sham." My throat tightened. The paper felt like ice on my fingers. I glanced at Lucia's hand, still dusted with apple skin, and the scar on my forearm pulsed under my cuff. The memory of my mother's sudden departure flashed. Perfume, slammed door, howling night. I swallowed, feeling the beast stir, teeth grazing my tongue. "You'll handle it," she said, stepping closer. Then a cough rippled through the den. Mara, my second in command, had slipped a thin folder onto the table. Inside, a list of recent transactions, each line marked with a coded symbol I'd never seen. I flipped the pages, paper crackling like dry leaves. "What is this?" I asked, voice low. She tilted her head, eyes flicking to a single photograph face down at the folder's edge. "Someone's moving money through a shell company," she whispered. "The name matches the one on my brother's scholarship application." The realization hit like a bite of cold wind. If the council linked the funds to Mateo's tuition, the board would have a reason to fire me and strip Lucia of any leverage. I felt the old habit rise, pull back, protect the pack, keep her at arm's length. Maybe we should pause this, I said, brushing the back of her chair, the wood warm from the fire. You belong to the books, not the battlefield. Her amber eyes narrowed. I've always been the one who hides. But I won't disappear when the wolf needs a cure. Outside, a distant siren wailed, threading through stone corridors like a warning. I turned my back, walked slowly toward the study, quietly, the door closing behind me. The night had settled into a low, gray hush when I finally slipped out of the study, the leather chair still warm where my back had pressed against it. The corridor beyond the doorway smelled of damp stone and the faint tang of old cigarette ash from the summer before. I moved past the portrait of my grandfather, his stern gaze still tracking the hallway, stopping at the kitchen where Lucia stood over the sink, the water curling around her hands like silver threads. Her shoulders were hunched, the flour on her forearms catching the dim light from the single bulb above the stove. She lifted a dishcloth, the fabric rough against her fingertips, and pressed it to the edge of the counter, the squeak of the metal drawer a soft protest. I could hear the faint clink of a spoon against a pot, the rhythm of boiling water ticking behind the glass. The heat rose in lazy spirals, mingling with the lingering scent of rosemary from the sauce she'd been simmering. You're late, she said without looking up, her voice a lilac ribbon threading through the steam. The words landed on me like a gentle push, the way a paw might nudge a sleeping wolf awake. I leaned against the doorway, the wood of the door frame cold against the side of my neck, and let the quiet settle between us. My eyes flicked to the scar on my forearm, the pale line catching the kitchen light as I flexed my wrist. The memory of the council's summons still sat like a stone in my gut, but the sharper ache was the weight of my own breath, the way it seemed to echo off the tile floor. I couldn't stay, I said, the words coming out steadier than I felt. My hand brushed the edge of the counter, the cool marble sending a shiver up my arm, a reminder that even the steadiness of stone could be shifted. She set the dishcloth down, her palm landing on the cool surface, and for a heartbeat the silence grew thick enough to hear the distant howl of a wolf beyond the ridge. The sound was a low, mournful thread that seemed to tie the room together, pulling at something deep inside me. Did you find what you were looking for? She asked, turning finally to face me. The light caught the faint curve of her cheek, the way the scar on her wrist, thin, pale, almost invisible, caught a glint as she moved. I met her gaze, the amber in my eyes catching the firelight from the stove. The scar on my forearm pulsed with a faint ache, a reminder of the night the moon turned red and the beast within surged beyond my control. Not the kind I'm used to, I replied, letting the breath from my lungs roll out in a slow, controlled exhale. My fingers curled around the edge of the counter, feeling the grain of the wood, the tiny imperfections that no hand could smooth out. She stepped closer, the smell of fresh dough and butter wrapping around us like a soft veil. Her hand hovered over the scar on my arm, the fingertip hovering just enough to feel the heat emanating from the skin without touching. She didn't reach, but the intention hung there, a question without words. The audit, she said, the lilac timbre of her voice tinged with something that sounded like resolve. They'll come for every ledger, every number, if they find a thread tied to Mateo. My breath caught. The thought of my brother's future tangled with the council's scrutiny was a knot tightening around my chest. I could feel the beast's claws digging into my ribs, a low growl that threatened to surface. Yet the presence of Lucia's steady hands, the way she held the spoon, the way her scalp brushed against the back of my neck, seemed to press a palm over that animal's mouth. I won't let that happen, I said, the words hard as stone. My hand moved, lifting the spoon and stirring the sauce, the rhythm of the motion grounding me. The sauce bubble rose and fell, a small amber tide. She watched, her eyes following the spoon's arc, the way the liquid caught the light, turning gold for an instant before settling. We could file a motion, she suggested, the thought hanging in the steam. use the irregularities in the accounts to our advantage. The board's own numbers aren't clean. A muffled thump came from the hallway, a footfall that shouldn't have been there. I turned, the door half open, the silhouette of Deputy Hale's coat disappearing into the shadows. A thin envelope slipped from the pocket of his coat, landing on the floor with a soft thud. I bent, the carpet's plushness pressing against my knees, and picked it up, the paper warm from my touch. Another summons, I muttered, unfolding it. The council's seal stamped the top in dark blue ink, the edges crisp. The words were terse, demanding an immediate hearing on the marriage's legitimacy. The paper crinkled, the sound sharp against the low hum of the kitchen. Lucia's hand brushed against mine as she reached for the envelope, the contact sending a jolt up my arm, the scarf flaring with a faint pulse. She read the contents, her brow furrowing, the lines around her eyes deepening. "They're pushing us," she whispered, the words barely louder than a breath. "We've already bent the rules to stay together," I replied, the syllable together feeling like a rope pulled taut. My mind flicked back to the night of the hunt, to the moment her song had stilled the beast within me. The memory was a still lake, the surface calm, the depths unseen. That night had shown me that a single note could quiet a wolf's howl, perhaps a single act could quiet the council's roar. She set the envelope on the table, the ink blotting slightly where her fingertips had pressed. The thought of the council's eyes, the whispers of the pack elders, the murmur of the board all converged like a storm unrolled over the ridge. Yet the kitchen's warmth, the scent of rosemary and butter, clung to us, a quiet counterpoint. "What's your plan?" she asked, her voice soft enough not to disturb the simmering sauce. I took a breath, feeling the air taste metallic, the way a wolf would inhale the scent of rain. "I need a shield." The words fell into the space between us, the syllables sharp. "Someone I can trust to stand with me when the council asks why an alpha would wed a human." She stared at me, the flicker of the stove light catching the amber in my eyes, the way my jaw tightened, the way my fingers twitched around the rim of the pot. The scar on my forearm seemed to glow, faint as a moonlit trail. "You've never trusted anyone," she said, the accusation wrapped in concern. Her hand moved, brushing the scar lightly, the pressure gentle but purposeful. "Not even your pack." The statement hit like a cold wind across the ridge. For a moment, the pack's howls seemed to swell outside the windows, a chorus of ancient voices demanding obedience. I felt the instinct to retreat, to hide behind the rules that had kept me safe for years. Yet beneath that, an unfamiliar pulse hers beat in time with my own. "I have a colleague," I said, the words sliding out like a smooth stone. "Mara, she knows the council's moves. If I can get her on board, we could argue that the marriage is a strategic alliance, not a breach of code." Lucia's gaze shifted, searching my face for the hesitation that always lingered there. The scar on her wrist caught the light, a thin line that seemed to mirror my own wound. She slipped her hand into my palm, the warmth of her skin a contrast to the coldness of my sleeve. "Will she listen?" she asked, her tone a mixture of doubt and hope. "I'll have to make it worth her," I replied, the thought of bargaining with Mara, a wolf whose loyalty was as sharp as her teeth surfacing. "She's been eyeing the council's financial leaks. If we give her the evidence I found in the ledger, those irregularities you spotted, she might see the benefit of protecting us." She squeezed my hand, the pressure steady, the callus on her thumb catching on the scar. "And if she doesn't?" Her eyes narrowed, the corner of her mouth lifting just enough to show a grin that cut through the tension like a knife through butter. "Then we'll have to find another way." I let the spoon stir the sauce again, the motion a metronome that seemed to sync with the beat of our hearts. The sauce thickened, the scent of rosemary deepening, the steam rising in curling ribbons that wrapped around the ceiling and disappeared into the darkness. A sudden knock echoed from the front door, the sound reverberating through the plaster walls. The wood paneling groaned under the impact, a reminder that the world outside was still pressing in. I glanced at the edge of the kitchen where the doorframe met the hallway, the light from the hallway spilling in, pale and unforgiving. Mara's silhouette appeared in the doorway, her coat dark as midnight, the badge on her chest catching the kitchen light. She stepped in, the click of her boots a crisp punctuation. The scar on her forearm was hidden beneath her sleeve, but the tension in her shoulders was evident, the way she held herself like a coiled spring. "Hi," she said, the tone low, the edges of her smile sharp. "You called?" I nodded, the weight of the envelope in my hand suddenly feeling heavier. "We need to talk." She crossed the room, the floorboards creaking beneath her feet, and took a seat at the table, the leather chair hugging her back. The scent of her cologne cypress and something metallic mixed with the rosemary, creating a heady blend that clung to my nostrils. Lucia stood behind me, her back to the stove, the heat seeping through her blouse, making the fabric cling to her skin. She watched Mara with a mixture of curiosity and caution, the way her eyes flicked to the scar on my arm, then to the ledger tucked under the table. Mara unfolded the envelope, the paper feeling rough as bark. "Council wants an immediate audit," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, the words cutting through the thickening steam. "They're using the marriage as leverage." I swallowed, the taste of copper rising in my throat. "We need a shield," I repeated, feeling the words settle like dust on a windowsill. "Someone who can vouch for the alliance." Mara's eyes flicked to the ledger, then back to me. "I've been hearing whispers," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "Grayson is moving funds through a shell company, one that matches the name on your brother's scholarship application." The revelation hit like a gust of wind through the pine trees outside, scattering leaves. Lucia's hand tightened on the edge of the counter, the knuckles whitening. The scar on my forearm seemed to pulse, a reminder that every secret carried a cost. "I can trace the money," Mara continued, tapping a finger against the paper. "But I need your help to make it count. If we expose Grayson, we undermine his leverage over the council." Lucia's brow furrowed, the line of worry deepening on her forehead. "And what about the marriage?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Will the council still push us apart?" Mara's smile was thin, the edges of her mouth curving like a wolf's snarl. "They'll try," she said. "But if we show that the marriage protects both the pack and the company, we can argue for its legitimacy. You need to present yourself not just as an alpha, but as a man who can bridge worlds." I felt the beast within shudder, the amber fire in my eyes flickering, the memory of the hunt's roar still echoing in my mind. I glanced at Lucia, the way her hair caught the firelight, the faint smudge of flour on her cheek. She stood there, a steady presence, the scent of cinnamon still clinging to her hair, a reminder that she had survived storms that most deemed insurmountable. "Then we present as partners," I said, the words forming like a pact. "Not as a pawn and a board." Mara nodded, her gaze shifting to the ledger, the numbers dancing under the kitchen light. "I'll pull the financial thread," she said. "You need to gather the pack, convince the council that an alpha's strength lies in his ability to protect, not just to dominate." Lucia stepped forward, the floorboard creaking under her weight, the soft rustle of her apron a whisper against the stone. She placed a hand on my forearm, the warmth of her skin a grounding force. "We can do this," she whispered, her breath warm against my ear, the scent of rosemary and dough mingling with the pine outside. "But we have to trust each other." The contact sent a ripple through me, the scar on my arm tingling as if acknowledging the truth behind her words. My own hand found hers, the grip firm yet gentle, the scar on my wrist aligning with the scar on hers, a silent acknowledgement of shared wounds. Mara watched us, eyes narrowing, as if measuring the calculus of our alliance. The kitchen seemed to shrink, the walls drawing closer, the fire now a low ember that cast long shadows across the floor. The scent of the sauce thickened, the rosemary turning sweet, the broth bubbling beneath the lid like a secret waiting to be revealed. "There's one more thing," Mara said, pulling a thin envelope from her coat. "A note from someone inside the council. They've been bribing a clerk to leak documents. If we can get that clerk's testimony, we can expose the corruption and give us leverage." She placed the envelope on the table, the paper rustling like dry leaves. I opened it, the ink inside smudged, the words barely legible. The name was a single initial L followed by a series of numbers. The ink smelled faintly of iron, as if the writer had been near blood. Lucia leaned over, the light from the stove painting her face in gold. Her eyes scanned the note, the line of her wrist catching the light. "Who could L be?" she asked, the question hanging in the humid air. Mara shrugged, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "That's the loop we have to follow," she said. "I can't tell you more without risking exposure." The kitchen door swung open again, a gust of cold wind blowing in, the smell of rain-soaked pine filling the room. A courier in a dark suit stood in the threshold, a briefcase in hand. He glanced at Mara, then at me, then at Lucia, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Reynolds," he said, voice smooth as silk, "the council has scheduled a hearing for tomorrow at noon. They're demanding that you both appear in person." Mara's eyes narrowed, the flicker of a smile crossing her lips. "Then we have less than 24 hours. I turned to Lucia, the weight of the briefcase in his hand a physical reminder of the ticking clock. She met my gaze, the amber in my eyes reflecting back at me, the scar on her wrist catching the firelight. The tension in the room tightened, the air thick with the scent of impending rain and the faint, metallic tang of fear. "We'll be ready," she said, the lilac timbre of her voice steady, though the tremor in her hand betrayed a flicker of doubt. I nodded, the decision crystallizing like ice forming on a windowpane. "We'll meet at dawn," I said, the words firm, the resolve in my voice echoing the bark of a wolf at sunrise. "You handle the numbers, I handle the pack, and we both stand together at the hearing." Mara stood, the chair scraping against the wood, the sound sharp as a knife. "I'll secure the financial trail," she promised. "You focus on the pack, make sure they understand the alliance isn't a threat." The courier turned to leave, the click of his shoes on the marble floor resonating like a metronome. As he disappeared down the hallway, the scent of his cologne lingered, a blend of cedar and stale leather, leaving a faint trail that seemed to follow the unseen path of the council's machinations. Silence fell over the kitchen, heavy as the night outside. The fire in the stove sputtered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Lucia's hand slipped from mine, the contact breaking, but the imprint of her palm on my forearm remained, a reminder that we were still bound together by something more than circumstance. I walked to the window, the glass cold against my fingertips, and stared out at the ridge where the moon, thin as a scythe, hung low. The wolves in the distance howled a mournful chorus, the sound rolling over the pine trees, a reminder that the pack was still out there, waiting, watching. "Do you think they'll accept us?" Lucia's voice floated behind me, soft as a sigh. I turned, the night wind threading through the open window, rustling the curtains like a whisper. "They'll have to," I said, the words a promise and a challenge. My gaze fell to my scar again, the pale line catching the light, a reminder that the road ahead would be fraught with claws and teeth, but also with possible salvation. She stepped closer, the carpet muffling her steps, and placed a hand on the windowsill, the wood warm from the lingering heat of the fire. "Then we'll make them see it," she whispered, the scent of cinnamon and rosemary mingling with the pine air, forming a tapestry of aromas that wrapped around us both. Mara's voice cut through the moment like a bark. "We'll need a contingency," she warned, pulling a small USB stick from her pocket, the metal glinting. "If the council tries to sabotage the hearing, I have a backup plan." I took the stick, the smooth plastic cool against my palm. The scar on my arm tingled as I held it, a subtle reminder that every action carried weight. "We'll be ready," I said, slipping the stick into the pocket of my coat. The night outside grew deeper, the rain beginning again in a soft patter against the glass. The sound was a steady drum, matching the rhythm of my heartbeat. The storm outside seemed to mirror the storm within, pressure building, tension ready to burst. Lucia turned to the stove, the sauce now a thick, glossy sheen, the rosemary leaves bright green against the dark broth. She ladled a spoonful into a bowl, the steam rising in concentric circles, the scent of rosemary and buttery broth enveloping us. Eat, she said, pushing the bowl toward me. The bowl's porcelain was cool, the edges smooth, the steam curling around the rim like a ghost. I lifted it, the heat warming my hands, the broth's depth an anchor in the swirling uncertainty. The first sip was a burst of flavor, the rosemary sharp, the broth rich, the taste anchoring me to this moment. The scar on my arm throbbed faintly, as if reminding me of the need for vigilance. Mara watched, the corner of her mouth twitching. "We have 1 hour before we need to leave for the council," she said, the urgency in her voice a low growl. I nodded, the weight of the decision settling like a stone in my gut. "I'll meet the pack at the den," I said, the words steady, the resolve building. "Tell them we stand together." Lucia's eyes flickered to my forearm, the scar catching the firelight. She placed her hand over the scar, the pressure gentle but firm. The warmth of her palm seeped into my skin, a subtle heat that seemed to calm the beast beneath. The contact felt like a tether, a promise that we would not let the darkness swallow us. Mara turned to the door, the night beyond the threshold a blur of rain and streetlights. "We'll move in 10 minutes, she announced, the urgency in her tone matching the ticking of the clock on the wall. I glanced at the clock, its hands moving slowly, each second a reminder that time was slipping. The room seemed to contract, the walls closing in, the scent of rosemary and rain intertwining, the crackle of the stove a heartbeat in the quiet. We stood together, the three of us bound by circumstance, by secret loops yet to be untangled, by the promise of a future that demanded we step beyond the roles we had been assigned. The fire sputtered, casting a final flare of amber across the scar on my arm, illuminating the line that had defined so much of my life. "Let's go," I said, the words a command and a plea. The night outside pressed against the windows, rain drumming a steady rhythm, the wolves' distant howls growing louder as if urging us forward. The door opened, the cold wind lashing in, the scent of wet stone and pine filling the space. I stepped through, the weight of the scar on Lucia's wrist, Mara's determined stare, and the flickering flame of the fire behind us, all of it a tapestry of threads waiting to be pulled, secrets still hidden, and a love that had begun as a forced contract but now pulsed with something fierce and undeniable. The kitchen was a furnace of heat and tension, the copper kettle whistling like a siren waiting for a rescue I could no longer promise. I stood at the sink, the water a scorching river against my palm, and watched the steam curl upward, tasting faintly of rosemary and the metallic bite of the council's summons that still smudged the edge of my mind. My fingers trembled around the porcelain mug I set down, the glaze catching the amber glow from the stove and turning it into a small, trembling sunrise. Kai's silhouette loomed in the doorway, his coat still damp from the rain that had begun again outside, droplets racing each other down the stone wall. The scar on his forearm pulsed a slow, almost imperceptible rhythm, as if the wound itself were counting down to something. He swallowed, the sound a low rumble that seemed to echo from somewhere deeper than his throat, and his eyes flicked to the envelope I'd left on the table earlier, a thin, cream-colored slip that smelled faintly of old paper and ink, the kind of scent that always meant secrets. "Lucia," he began, his voice a measured cadence that rarely betrayed anything, "the council wants us to appear together at noon. They'll ask why an alpha would bind himself to a human accountant." I turned, the back of my hand still slick with flour as I dried it on my apron, and met his gaze. The amber flickered in his eyes, a flash of the beast I'd seen quieted for a heartbeat in the forest. My own throat tightened around the words I'd been rehearsing, each one a knot of fear and resolve. "I told them we're a legal partnership, not a marriage," I said, the lilac timbre of my voice catching on the edge of the word legal. My fingers brushed the scar on my wrist, the faint line catching the stove's light. "The board will see the numbers, the council the contracts. They won't care about the feelings." His jaw tightened, the muscles shifting beneath the faint hair on his chin, and he took a step forward, the worn soles of his boots making a soft thud against the cold tile. Feelings, he repeated, almost to himself, as if the word were a blade he was trying to sharpen in his mind. That's what the pack whispers about you, about us. That we'll let softness bleed into the pack's bloodline and dissolve the power that keeps us alive. I swallowed, the taste of copper flooding my mouth, and the memory of my brother's acceptance letter resurfaced his bright grin, the hope that had finally cracked the wall of debt that had loomed over our lives like a storm cloud. My mind flitted to the ledger I'd found hidden in the study, the irregular transactions masked by a code only Mara seemed to understand, and to the envelope I'd tucked in my apron, the one Mara had slipped to me with the promise that the council's audit would crumble under its own corruption. "Do you remember the night on the ridge?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could temper it, "when the wolves chased us through the snow and I sang that lullaby my mother used to hum?" He stared at the floor, the firelight dancing on the soot-stained bricks, and for a moment the animal in him seemed to retreat, the amber in his eyes dimming to a softer gold. "You saved me," he said quietly, the words almost a whisper against the hiss of the kettle. "You pulled the beast back from the edge." The memory made a tremor run through my spine, a reminder of the moment my voice had cut through his roar, and of the way his hand had lingered on the scar on my wrist for a heartbeat longer than necessary. I wanted to reach for that hand, to pull him into the kitchen and shut the world out, but the envelope in my pocket was a weight that demanded attention. "Someone left a note in the ledger," I said, the words snapping like a twig. "A name L that matches the shell company Grayson's using. If we can prove that, the council's leverage evaporates." His eyes snapped up, sharp as a hawk's, and he stepped closer, the heat from the fire licking his cheek. "And what if that leads to a dead end? What if the council decides that love is a betrayal and they exile me for endangering the pack?" The question cut through me like a cold wind through pine needles. I felt a sudden need to protect him, to become the shield he'd never allowed anyone to be for him. But the scar on my wrist, the quiet ache that trailed it, reminded me of every time I'd let people see the flaw I'd hidden, a flaw I believed made me unworthy, dangerous, a burden. I had spent years slipping unnoticed behind invices, letting fear dictate my worth, convincing myself that any affection would only expose the cracks in my own foundation. "The council will see us together and think we're using each other," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "They'll think I'm a pawn, that you're a trophy, and the pack will think I've corrupted your bloodline. Both of them will see the same thing, a weakness we can't afford." Kai's hand hovered near the edge of the counter, his fingers grazing the wood, the grain rough against his palm. He could have touched me, could have closed the distance, but he pressed his palm flat on the table instead, as if anchoring himself to something more solid than my presence. "If I step away, the pack will see it as a betrayal to our code," he said, the words deliberate, each syllable a stone placed in a wall. "If you stay, you'll be the one they punish." A sudden knock reverberated through the hallway, the sound sharp as a wolf's howl, and the door swung open a fraction, revealing a thin figure cloaked in a dark coat. Deputy Hale stood there, his badge catching the firelight and glinting like a cold star. He slipped a sealed envelope into Kai's hand without a word, the paper warm from the heat of the opening, and his eyes flicked to me, a hint of something, perhaps pity, perhaps calculation glimmering behind his steel-gray irises. "Council summons," Hale announced, his voice smooth, the syllables rolling like polished stone. "They'll be waiting for both of you at the hearing. We expect full cooperation. Failure will be considered an act of treason against the city." Kai's jaw clenched, the scar on his forearm catching a flicker of flame, and he turned his gaze back to me. "You understand what this means for you, Lucia? If I'm exiled, you lose the protection of the pack. If the board dismantles Reynolds Holdings, you lose everything you've built for your brother and yourself." The thought landed like a weight in my stomach, the iron taste of dread rising as the reality of my brother's tuition loomed larger than ever. I imagined Mateo's hopeful eyes, his future now tangled in a web I had not chosen to spin. I glanced at the ledger on the table, the numbers still haunting me with their cryptic symbols, and the envelope I'd hidden under my apron, its contents a possible key or a dead end. I felt the tears gathering at the corners of my eyes, hot and salty, and I pressed a hand to my throat as if to stop the flood. "I can't be the reason you lose your pack," I whispered, the lilac timbre trembling like a moth's wing. Kai's shoulders sagged, the beast within him a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "And I can't be the reason you lose the only chance you have to keep your brother's future alive," he replied, his voice cracking just enough to let the fear slip through the cracks of his armor. "The council will use this marriage as a weapon. They'll strip us both of everything." The room seemed to shrink, the fire's amber glow turning into a harsh, unforgiving light that highlighted the lines of worry etched into our faces. The scent of rosemary and burnt pine mingled with the metallic tang of the kettle, creating a heady atmosphere that made the air feel thick, as if each breath were a fight for survival. A faint rustle came from the pantry, a soft scrape of a mouse in the walls, and I caught a glimpse of a scrap of paper fluttering on the floor, a forgotten shopping list, a reminder that the world outside our crisis continued its ordinary rhythm. The noise was absurdly trivial, a reminder that the house held countless corners still untouched by our turmoil. Kai's hand slipped from the table, his knuckles white, and for a split second his thumb brushed the scar on my wrist, the contact brief but electric. I could feel the heat of his skin against mine, the lingering scent of his cologne cypress, iron, the ghost of blood that seemed to cling to his flesh like a promise. In that instant, the possibility of staying together flashed, a fragile ember in a storm. "Whatever we do, we have to be honest," he said, the words a low growl that resonated deep in my chest. "If there's even a chance that this us will bring the pack to ruin, I have to end it before we both become nothing but a warning." My breath hitched, the realization that he was choosing exile over love settling like a stone in my gut. I thought of the endless nights I had spent hiding behind numbers, the way I told myself I was unworthy of love, that any affection would only expose my flaws, the lie that I could not be loved without destroying everything now pressed against my ribs, a weight I could no longer bear. "Then we end it," I said, my voice barely above the hiss of the kettle. "We walk away before the council can use us as a pawn, before the pack can cast us out. It's the only way to keep the people we care about from being torn apart." Kai's eyes flickered, amber turning to a mournful gray as he stared at the ceiling, the fire's light reflecting off the scar on his forearm like a distant star. He turned his gaze to the envelope in his hand, the seal unbroken, the paper cold as stone. I watched his breath fog the glass of the window, the condensation spreading like a map of paths he could no longer take. "For now," he murmured, the words a promise and a surrender intertwined. "We keep this facade. We stay apart when the council comes. You return to the office, I return to the den. We'll pretend the marriage is a contract, not a bond. Anything else would be a death sentence for both of us." The words hung in the kitchen, heavy as the pine-scented wind that slipped through the cracked window. I felt a tear slide down my cheek, the salty trail catching the firelight, and I wiped it away with the back of my hand, the flour still dusting my skin. The scar on my wrist pulsed one last time, a reminder that the wound would always be there, even if we tried to stitch it over with silence. A muffled thud echoed from the hallway, a courier's boots hitting the marble, a reminder that the council's summons was already en route. The paper I'd hidden under my apron rustled, the thin envelope shifting against the fabric, a silent promise of a secret path that now seemed more like a dead end. I turned to the stove, the broth bubbling softly, the rosary leaves floating like tiny green lanterns. I ladled a spoonful into a bowl, the steam rising in curling ribbons, the scent wrapping around me like a blanket I could no longer afford to share. "Take the money, Lucia," Kai said, his voice distant, the words a command and a benediction. "Use it to protect Matteo. Let me bear the cost of the council's hatred. Let the pack remember me as a leader who chose duty over desire." I stared at the spoon, the liquid amber in my palm, and felt the last thread of hope snap. The night outside pressed against the windows, rain drumming a relentless rhythm, the wolves' distant howls rising in a mournful chorus. The fire sputtered, the flames licking the stone, casting shadows that stretched across the floor like dark fingers reaching out, trying to pull us back together, even as the world outside threatened to tear us apart. In the quiet that followed, I could hear the faint ticking of the hallway clock, each second a reminder that time was slipping away, that the council's hearing would come, that the pack would decide my fate, and that we had just sealed a separation that felt inevitable, cruel, and final. Kai. I slipped out of the mansion before dawn, the stone steps cold against the soles of my boots. The air outside the gate smelled of wet pine and the faint metallic bite of early traffic, a reminder that the city never sleeps. My pack's den lay a half-mile away, a hollow of ash and fur where the alpha's voice usually pulsed through the night. Tonight, I walked alone, the rhythm of my heart matching the distant clack of a train on the tracks beyond the ridge. The path wound through a stand of silver firs, each needle brushing my cheek as I passed. A red-flashed firefly darted past, its glow fleeting, and I paused, the light catching the pale line on my forearm. My thumb brushed the scar, the skin still rough where the blood moon had torn 3 years ago. I pressed my hand harder, feeling the old sting rise, a reminder that power without trust corrodes from the inside. At the edge of the woods, a rusted metal fence marked the boundary of the old quarry. A rusted barrel sat half buried in gravel, its lid warped from years of rain. Inside, I could hear the low scrape of water pooling, the scent of mineral earth rising as the wind shifted. I knelt, the cold stone biting my knee, and reached for a loose stone, turning it over. Beneath it lay a small, worn leather notebook, its cover softened by damp. I flipped it open. The first page bore a name Mara scribbled in hurried ink beside a series of numbers that didn't match any ledger I'd seen. The margins were filled with a looping script, a woman's name I didn't recognize, initials L. My breath caught, the notebook's weight grounding me in a question I hadn't anticipated. Why had someone hidden this here, and what did it mean for the pack's finances? I stood, the wind tugging at the jacket's lapel, and heard a distant howl that seemed to come from the den itself. My chest tightened, not from fear of the pack but from the realization that I had been steering every decision through the lens of control, never allowing another's hand to guide. The scar on my forearm pulsed again, this time not from pain but from a pressure building beneath the surface, like a tide pulling at a shoreline. I lifted the notebook, tucked it into my coat, and kept walking, each step a silent promise to listen to the whisper of the wind rather than the roar of my own authority. The sunrise hit the ridge, amber light spilling over the valley. I paused at a low stone bench, the surface slick with dew. I placed the notebook beside me, the pages fanning open to a line that read, "Trust the one who needs dough, not the one who counts grains." The words struck like a cold draft, and I felt the old belief love equals weakness crack, not because Lucia had softened me, but because the world had offered a different kind of proof. I closed the notebook, the leather creaking, and watched the light catch a distant silhouette of a wolf pack moving through the mist, their bodies low, ears attuned to the wind. I inhaled the scent of pine sap and earth, letting the breath fill the space where the beast's growl used to echo. The decision to let the pack see me as more than a ruler settled in my gut, not as a concession to anyone else but as a claim on my own steadiness. Lucia. I left Kai's study with the ledger tucked under my arm, the thin paper warm from the night's fire. The hallway was silent except for the faint hum of the old furnace, its heat leaking through the stone walls like a slow tide. Outside, rain began to tap the mansion's tall windows, each drop a soft percussion that seemed to echo the steady rhythm of the kitchen's old copper kettle. I walked down the stone corridor toward the kitchen, my shoes muffling against the polished marble. The scent of rosemary and butter grew stronger, pulling me toward the hearth where the stew simmered, its surface rippling with tiny bubbles. I set the ledger on the table, the weight of the numbers a tangible pressure against my wrist. As I reached for a wooden spoon, my hand brushed the scar at the base of my thumb, a faint, pale line I'd not noticed since the accident that left me with a busted kneecap at 16. The scar pricked as the metal of the spoon touched it, sending a tiny shock up my arm, a reminder that even small injuries lingered long after they healed. I ladled broth into a bowl, the steam curling up like a faint violet veil, and tasted it. The rosemary was sharp. The broth carried a hint of iron that reminded me of the audit summons I'd received that morning. I set the bowl down, the ceramic cool against my palm, and stared at the ledger's bottom line, a discrepancy marked with an asterisk, a number that didn't align with any invoice I could recall. My eyes drifted to the corner of the table where a single paperclip, bent into a tiny loop, lay unattended. I lifted it, feeling the cold metal press against my fingertip, and thought of the note Mara had slipped to Kai, an envelope sealed with blue ink, the kind used for confidential correspondence. I slipped the paperclip into the ledger, the click echoing like a secret being locked away. The kitchen door creaked open, and a gust of wind pushed in the scent of wet stone and distant fire. The pantry door stood ajar, a faint glow seeping from behind it. Curiosity tugged at me. I stepped forward, the floorboards groaning under my weight. Inside, jars of dried herbs lined the shelves, their labels handwritten in a looping script. One jar, lavender, had a piece of parchment tucked between the glass and the cork. I pulled it out. The paper bore a single line: "The council watches, but the city breathes." The ink was smudged where a fingertip had pressed, as if someone had tried to hide the message quickly. My pulse quickened, not because I feared the council's reach, but because the words hinted at a wider net I had been ignoring, my own tendency to let external judgments dictate my worth. I slipped the parchment into my pocket, feeling the rough cotton against my thigh, and moved back to the stove. The stew bubbled, releasing a burst of savory steam that wrapped around my face like a warm scarf. I lifted the spoon again, this time stirring slowly, letting the motion set a rhythm in my chest. As the spoon moved, I thought of the countless nights I'd stayed late, poring over balance sheets, convincing myself that numbers were safe, that emotions were variables to be eliminated. The clink of metal on metal reminded me that precision could never capture the messiness of life, that my fear of being seen as the fat accountant was a story I'd been telling myself, not a fact etched in stone. I poured a cup of tea, the kettle's whistle rising sharp, then soft, and watched the steam rise, spiraling like the lace of a forgotten dress. The cup's handle was smooth, the ceramic warm, and as I lifted it to my lips, the bitter taste of the brew mixed with a faint hint of cinnamon remnants from Lucia's earlier baking. I set the cup down, the porcelain clinking against the saucer, and felt a small tear slip down my cheek, catching the light before it fell onto the table's wood grain. I didn't wipe it. Instead, I let it dry, a silent acknowledgement that the weight of my brother's future, the pressure of the board, and the secret ledger all pressed on me like a new kind of debt. The rain intensified, pattering louder against the windows, each drop a drumbeat that urged me forward. I reached for a ledger page, the thin paper rustling under my fingers, and traced the irregular transaction with my thumb, the faint oil from my skin leaving a ghostly line. In the margin, a smudge formed a shape, half a wolf's silhouette, almost too subtle to see. I stared, the image a reminder that the pack's presence lingered even when I tried to separate myself from it. I stood, the kettle's whistle fading, and walked to the balcony, the cold air slapping my cheeks. The city lights flickered below, a mosaic of amber and cobalt. I breathed in the damp night, the scent of rain on stone mingling with the distant aroma of street food carts. My mind drifted to the ledger, to the hidden notebook I'd found, to the scar on my wrist that still throbbed faintly. I realized that the lock I had placed around my heart wasn't forged by Kai's expectations, but by the belief that my own inadequacies rendered me unworthy of partnership. The wind lifted a stray napkin from the balcony railing, twirling it like a forgotten secret waiting to be read. I turned back, the metal of the balcony's iron railing cold beneath my palm, and felt the resolve settle like sediment in a glass of water. The transformation was not a gift from anyone else, it was a quiet untying of ropes I had wrapped around myself. I would no longer count each expense to prove I was enough, nor would I let the council's whispers define my value. The ledger, the notebook, the scar, all were clues pointing toward a version of me that could stand on its own. As I stepped back inside, the kitchen lights hummed, the stew bubbling in anticipation, and I heard a soft thud from the hallway. Mara's boots, perhaps, returning with a new piece of evidence. I glanced toward the study door, the faint outline of a silhouette against the frosted glass, and felt a pulse of curiosity rise. The night was far from over, and the mysteries I had uncovered promised more than just numbers. They hinted at alliances and betrayals that could change everything. I set the kettle down, the steam curling like a question mark, and waited for the next piece to fall into place. The rain had stopped, leaving the ridge glistening like a sheet of hammered silver. I slipped out of the carriage as the front door of the mansion creaked behind me, the scent of pine sap and wet stone filling the hallway. My coat was still damp, the leather cuffs slick against my forearm where the scar pulsed with a faint warmth that wasn't fear, it was anticipation. I paused at the kitchen doorway, watching the fire's last embers glow amber behind the copper pot, and heard the soft clink of a spoon against a pot lid. Lucia stood there, back to me, her hands dusted with flour, a wooden spoon suspended over a simmering broth that sent thin ribbons of rosemary steam curling toward the ceiling. She didn't turn. Instead, she set the spoon down, the metal ringing like a small bell, and reached for the battered ledger on the oak table. Her fingers lingered on the torn edge, the same edge where I'd found the notebook in the quarry. She glanced at the inked numbers, then at the scar on her wrist, where the faint line caught the firelight, and lifted her gaze to meet mine. "You came back on your own," she said, the lilac timbre cracking just enough to let a tremor slip through. The words landed on the tiles, echoing off the stone walls, and I felt the old instinct to retreat shrink beneath my ribs. "I'm not the one who runs," I replied, stepping forward, the cold floorboards sending a shiver up my boots. My hand brushed the scar on my forearm, the pulse steady as a drumbeat. I thought the council's summons would keep us apart. I was wrong. She lifted a small, crumpled note from the ledger's margin, its parchment still warm from the fire. "Mara's file on Grayson's shell company." I copied the ledger code, but the key is missing. Her thumb traced the faint smudge where someone had tried to erase a name. The secret lingered like a scent of iron in the air. I reached for the notebook I'd carried back from the quarry, the leather softened by night's damp. I found a line, "Trust the one who needs dough." It sounded like a riddle, but now it's a map. It points to the old greenhouse, where the council's hidden cameras were disabled months ago. I opened the cover, the pages whispering as I turned them, the faint ink of a name L glinting like a promise. She set the note aside, eyes flicking to the copper kettle, where a drop of condensation fell onto the brass and sizzled. "If we expose the shell company, the council will lose leverage, but the pack will still need to decide if an alpha can love a human." I stepped closer, the heat from the fire licking my cheek, and placed my hand over hers, the callus of my palm meeting the soft pad of her wrist. The scar on my arm brushed the scar on hers, a silent testimony of wounds that had once driven us apart. "I won't ask the council to approve us. I ask my pack to see us as a bridge, not a breach." She smiled, a curve that softened the lines of her face, and lifted a freshly baked roll, the crust crackling as she broke it. The scent of toasted butter mingled with the rosemary, and she placed the piece into my mouth. The taste was warm, grounding, like the first time I had heard my mother hum while kneading dough. "Then we bring the proof to the council together. No one else decides." A faint rustle erupted from the hallway. Mara's boots, silent as a wolf's footfall, disappearing into shadows. I heard the distant howl of the pack beyond the ridge, a note of approval that lingered in the wind. Lucia's hand tightened around mine, the grip firm enough to steady a pack's leader, gentle enough to soothe an alpha's beast. We turned toward the study, the ledger, the notebook, the unresolved key, and the council's looming hearing. The fire sputtered, casting our silhouettes against the stone, two figures choosing each other despite the threats that still waited beyond the walls.